David, I'd really like to know what it was like studying under all those famous poets at Harvard, Heaney, Walcott, especially Robert Fitzgerald.
Very well. Where do I begin?
I was deeply committed to this path from a very early age.
My childhood was typical.
And I was at Harvard at a time which, in the long and storied poetic history of the institution, may have been a golden moment.
Summers in Rangoon, luge lessons.
When I was an undergrad, they were all teaching there at one time. Czeslaw Milosz was giving the Charles Eliot Norton lectures in 1979-80. He won the prize on a day when he was giving a lecture, which was really like a class. And we all went in, and there was the Nobel laureate in literature talking to us. And his lectures became the book, The Witness of Poetry. I didn't understand a word he said when I was there, but I knew I was in the presence of a great writer and poet. I could feel it in the air. And of course, now I understand far better what he was doing. And in my view, he dwarfed any other American poet I'd ever met, including Allen Ginsberg, who came by, who was a very fine poet and crazy, but very, very knowledgeable and very gifted and very difficult.
He would make outrageous claims like he invented the question mark.
But so Milosz was a brilliant lecturer. You really felt like you were in the presence of history being transformed into verse, historical consciousness. Although he could also be very charming and funny and witty. But I didn't really study with him individually, but I was in his presence and chatted with him. So he was a lecturer in what would now, I suppose, be considered an older European style. Seamus and Derek were, just stunningly gifted. This is before they won the prize. I think they were both great, I would say. I think Walcott had the most astonishing natural linguistic gifts of almost anyone I've ever met. But they were poets, not teachers. They were there for their star power, and they were very charming, very gifted, very dynamic, but they had no curriculum and no pedagogy. And the same could be true of Mark Strand, who, although he didn't win the Nobel Prize, was obviously one of the strongest American poets working at the time. And I remember sitting there with them in class, and they just ran Iowa workshops. Somebody would put a poem on the table and it would get passed around, and then there'd be comments. And as gifted as they were, and despite the many brilliant things they said and how charming they all were, they didn't really have a way to teach what they knew how to do. Because in order to do that well, you have to have a curriculum and you have to have a pedagogy. And without that, you're not going to be likely to achieve what you would like to as a teacher. And then when I walked into Fitzgerald's class, I was just stunned. Because as a musician, especially, like as Susan is, I could feel that there was something that nobody was showing me and that was clearly going on in these poems. But of course, in the mid-'70s, when this was happening, late 70s, nobody was interested in it. And there were only 4 or 5 people teaching this stuff. Maybe Miller Williams at Arkansas, J.D. Cunningham, Brandeis, Lou Turco in upstate New York, maybe a couple of others, not many. And Robert Fitzgerald may have been the most rigorous of all because he was, of course, a very gifted, knowledgeable, subtle scholar of Greek and Latin and Italian, among other languages. And he was very genteel, of an utterly different school than I was. No one's ever called me genteel. I do my best. And I fail. And in any event, his course was just astonishing. He said, we will not be having a workshop here. This is a class in how to write verse forms. And his class included many of the forms that are in the chapters of our textbook. Stress-based imitations of classical quantitative forms, Anglo-Saxon strong stress meter, what he called riding rhyme, and what not only he, but Shakespeare calls it that as well, which is sort of an imitation of Chaucer and couplets, iambic tetrameter rhymed couplets, triple meters, free verse, and then he also included things like he loved rhyme royal and the sonnet, so he would introduce these other Anglo-Saxon strong stress alliterative meters. I still use a lot of his material when I teach these things. And I'm honored. For some reason, I seem to be one of the very few people. I think Susan and I, our book might be the first one that actually introduces and explains and preserves the Fitzgerald system of scansion, which is an utterly brilliant innovation, utterly brilliant in many ways that we could talk about if we get into the technical side of things. But he was the one, he changed my life. I went on to, I'd had wonderful teachers before that who had laid the groundwork. and many others after who were stunning. I mean, I really got to study with Harold Bloom, Dennis Donahue was my dissertation director, Helen Vendler, many others. But it was Fitzgerald who really set me on this path. And I wrote my PhD dissertation on prosody and versification, which is, when you're going out for an academic job, it's about like showing up at a dinner party and announcing that you're a leper and then inviting people to dance. It's very challenging. But that's what it was like. I mean, being around Strand, Milosz, Walcott, and Heaney was a tremendous privilege. They were all very gifted people who did great work. But it was Fitzgerald who also, even though his own verse may not have been quite as well known as theirs, obviously, although his translations have sold millions of copies, it was Fitzgerald who had a pedagogy and a curriculum, and all of a sudden it all made sense. And I thought, there's a history, there's a system, there's a structure, there's a process, and it's possible to actually learn how to do this. So most of my pedagogical principles in this area and curricular principles and the structure of that entire textbook, as we make clear in the introduction, derives from his truly shining and marvelous example as a teacher. It was utterly extraordinary, and I think he had that effect on almost everyone who studied with him. And it's not surprising that a number of people who did became such strong poets and critics. He was extraordinary. It's very important to me, and I hope to my students as well, to pass on this legacy. But I also am painfully aware of how much more Fitzgerald understood about a number of things that I never will. He was obviously a tremendous scholar of Greek, and I have small Latin and less Greek. But I understand the concepts, and I did enough Latin to certainly understand what was going on. But to pass this on and keep it alive, it's important to understand it. It would have never completely died. But the numbers of people who were teaching this material in any coherent way were, if not infinitesimal, then close. J.D. Cunningham taught Tim Steele, Fitzgerald taught me, and Dana Joya and Jackie Osro and these other folks I've mentioned. And there were really not many of us. Now there are somewhat more, but of course it's still, you feel like Robin Hood in the woods or something.